Hey, good morning, friends. Today is Wednesday, April the 16th, 2025, and the time now is 7:16 a.m. So, friends, I want to talk briefly about the African Union, and I want to talk specifically about a recent event between the African Union and Israel. This basically pertaining to Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia being expelled from the African Union. Now, friends, if this is your first time watching my video, if this is your first time watching videos from this channel, or if you are new to this channel, The Echoing Voice, this is how the channel is set up. Every international institution, and I'm talking about prominent international institutions, such as the AU, African Union, the United Nations, NATO, BRICS, and so on, will have a playlist on this channel. In this case, we are talking about the African Union. The African Union will have a playlist on this channel in which I will discuss videos, talks, programs, or ideas pertaining to the domestic situation in Africa as relating to the African Union. Basically, the African Union interaction with other countries or countries in Africa, countries' interaction with one another through the African Union in Africa, and the African Union's relations with countries and institutions around the world. Also, every country will have a playlist on this channel. For example, one playlist will be named the country's name and the other domestic the country's name. The country's name playlist will feature videos, talks, programs, or ideas that feature or specifically talk about the country's geopolitical position, the country's interaction with other countries in its region and around the world. However, the domestic the country's name playlist will feature videos, talks, programs, or ideas that pertains to the domestic situation within the country. And we are talking in this case about economics, trade, infrastructure, development, academics or education, food security, okay, poverty, and so on and so on and so on. Now, friends, in terms of the African Union and Israel, recently there was supposed to be an event, or there was an event in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, held in the Nelson Mandela Hall in the AU, the African Union, which was supposed to commemorate the genocide in Rwanda, the Rwandan Genocide. It is said that the ambassador of Israel to Ethiopia attended the event. Now, it is very interesting that this ambassador is a black man. Okay, he is an African in terms of his origin. Now, friends, if we are to backtrack, in 2023, there was also an incident in the African Union when an Israeli ambassador or official was expelled. She attended an event, and it was said that this ambassador or this Israeli official was not supposed to be there. She had no clearance, so she had no point of being there. Now, in Africa, you have these situations where a lot of Muslim majority countries, and also dealing with the sensitivity of what is happening in Gaza, in Palestine, and African insecurity or African suspicion of the West is increasing to the point where for many African countries and dignitaries or diplomats, Israel could be seen as a Trojan horse. So they have to be very careful, or at least that's what I think that they are doing. Now, fast forward to recent times, okay, about last week or so. You have an event when, or in which the Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia, who is also an African, okay, in terms of his ethnicity, was revoked. Israel is basically accusing South Africa and also Algeria, which Israel did before in 2023, that they are basically creating an atmosphere that is leading to anti-Israeli sentiment within the African Union. Now, it is said that the Israeli invitation or clearance within the African Union, the observer status, had been revoked or canceled or suspended. Now, African Union is said to have given about 87 countries or so observer status within the African Union. It is interesting that I tried to do a research to see which countries have observer status within the African Union. I couldn't find any country that was not the traditional Western countries, the big and powerful, okay, economically richer and so on countries in the world. The United States, the United Kingdom, and these prominent countries and institutions. That prompted me to ask whether Haiti, Barbados, or other Afro Caribbean states or Afro Latin American states have observer status within the African Union. I know recently there was a situation where Haiti was trying to become member of the African Union and it was basically dealt with. Now, my friends, if you ask me, I do believe that if Israel is going to have an observer status within the African Union, every Afro Caribbean, Afro Latin American state must have observer status within the African Union. And I also believe if Israel's invitation or clearance to become an observer state within the African Union is going to be reinstated, then I think Haiti should then reapply to become a member of the African Union or an observer of the African Union. I do think it is bad politics and bad diplomacy that African Union is extending member or observer state, okay, observer status to other countries and not to African diasporic countries. I think it is a bad policy because the thing is, in order for Africans to liberate themselves, Africans throughout the diaspora must unify diplomatically, socially, politically, economically, and so on and so on and so on. Now, friends, moving back to the situation between Israel and the African Union, to me, it is becoming very annoying or it is appearing to look very suspicious. The way Israel is pushing itself into the African Union. Yes, it is said that Israel is doing this as a means to contest the influence of the Palestinians within the African Union. However, looking at Israel's relationship with the West or to the West, looking at what is happening in Gaza, looking at the divide, okay, within the Muslim camp or the Arab camp, and looking at the religious situation in Africa, Christian against Muslims and all those kind of nonsense. I think Africans have to recalculate and they have to be very careful in how they interact with Israel or even with Gaza in this case. Because one thing Africa has to be very careful with or about is the fact that Africa has been divided in many ways for so long. And Africans must be very careful to make sure that there shouldn't be any reinstatement of tension in Africa between Muslims and Christians. I do think Africans have to be very careful to prevent the situation in the Middle East between Arabs and the Palestinians against Israel or between Judaism and Islam to basically spill into Africa. Because Africa also is already dealing with its own issue. Whether we are talking about lack of development, lack of infrastructure, financial, economic, food insecurity, and destabilization of various sorts. Now, in terms of the situation with the Israeli ambassador, I think Israel also has to acknowledge the fact that Africa is trying to navigate a very tense international political system or political situation. The prevention of Israeli diplomat within the African Union, okay, the African Union's meeting at a very stressful or difficult time is something that Israel has to be very considerate of the African Union. And friends, Israel should not be talking about the African Union as if it is a bully of the African Union. The African Union is a massive, yes, powerless compared to other international institutions, but the African Union is made up of about 54 African countries, and Africa having the largest voting bloc in the United Nations. Countries have their individual interest, and Africa as a people, of course, to an extent, whether we are talking about Greater Africa or Black Africa, of course, to an extent, it hasn't been codified or institutionalized. But as Black people, we do have an interest in how we see international relations. At a time when Israel is being accused of genocide in Gaza, in Palestine, trying to, okay, Israel or Israeli ambassador trying to attend an African Union event commemorating the Rwandan genocide. I think politically, I think it doesn't sit well or didn't sit well for many African countries and diplomats or dignitaries. I think Israel played a very fine game, a very interesting game where Israel was checkmated. And Israel has to also acknowledge the fact that this is how politics work. The African countries and dignitaries and so on, they do have conscience, whether truthful or not. Now, friends, it should be acknowledged, as long as the African Union has revoked the Israeli ambassador invitation or clearance within the African Union, or prevent them diplomatically from attending an African Union event, Israeli ambassadors and dignitaries or officials should not be showing up where they are not invited, where they have no clearance, especially when they know that they have no clearance. Because what that does is it demonstrates lack of respect for Africa and African Union. It demonstrates desperation and suspicion. And friends, for Africa as a community, Africans as a people, as a global community, and as a diaspora, Africa is very sensitive. So, a non African country trying to impose itself in a manner in which Israel is trying to participate in the African Union event is very suspicious for many Africans. Now, friends, please tell me what you think, and I really want to know what you think. But, friends, I am going to end here. I want to thank you for being a member of the Echoing Voice community, my friends. But most especially and most importantly, or most important, I want to thank you a lot for watching the Echoing Voice. Peace.